G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Ezekiel. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this session. We're into session 34. We're going to hopefully get through chapter 40, verse 47 down to chapter 42, verse 9. We're looking at the millennial temple. We're looking tonight at we see there the chart, the charts I gave you last session. Number 15 is where we're looking at here, the inner court and the altar of sacrifice. Verse 47, and he measured the court 100 cubits long and 100 cubits broad, foursquare, and the altar was before the house. Now, first part of this verse, he deals with the inner court. The inner court there is number 15, if you can look at that slide there. And he measured the court, meaning he measured the inner court, and we're told that it was 100 cubits long and 100 cubits broad, so it was square. So that is 53.2 meters, or 175 feet. That's what 100 cubits is. Now we're also told that the inner court was foursquare. This means that the innermost threshold of the three gateways to the inner court formed an area surrounding 50 cubits in depth. And this area of the inner court was measured from the inner front of the three gates along the front and back, and it came out to 100 cubits square. As I said, lots of numbers in this. If you're an architect, wonderful. Now in the second part of the verse, he mentions the altar of sacrifice that stood before the house. And this is the house is a temple here. And what we're told is that this altar stood at the center of the inner court and in front of the temple, in front of the temple building. Now, that is all he says about the altar of sacrifice for now. We're going to see some more detail when we get to chapter 43, verses 13 to 17. So this brings us to the temple building itself, which we see there on your diagram there, or schematic. Okay, now this is just a standalone image of the temple. You see the two pillars there at the front. You see the stairs going up, enter the holy place, enter the Holy of Holies. All right, now the temple is going to go from chapter 40, verse 48, down to chapter 41, verse 26. And it's going to be subdivided into some smaller units. And there's also a diagram of the temple building, which we just saw there. You can look back at that if you have the notes. Now, the temple porch or the vestibule we see in verses 48 to 49. Then he brought me to the porch of the house, and he measured each post of the porch, 5 cubits on this side, 5 cubits on that side, and the breadth of the gate was 3 cubits on this side, 3 cubits on that side. The length of the porch was 20 cubits, the breadth 11 cubits, even by the steps whereby they went up to it. And there were pillars by the posts, one on this side and another on that side. So as he now begins to deal with the temple building itself, he first deals with the porch or the vestibule in verses 48 to 49. And in dealing with this vestibule area, Ezekiel tells us 4 things here. First of all, he talks about the posts. It's in the first part of verse 48. Then he brought me to the porch of the house. So from the inner court where he had been, he's now conducted to the east front of the temple building. Remember, the entrance comes up to the temple comes from the eastern side. Then the angel, he measured each post of the porch, 5 cubits on this side, 5 cubits on that side. That means they were 2.65 meters or 8 feet 9 inches, right? This is the thickness of these posts. From east to west, on each side of the entryway was the same dimensions as the wall of the porch. You really need to have those diagrams in front of you. So in that respect, it resembled the Solomonic temple, which you can go back and have a look at. 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 21. 1 Kings 7:21. Now, the second thing he deals with in the second part of verse 48 is the gate. He says the breadth of the gate was 3 cubits on this side, 3 cubits on that side, which is approximately equivalent to 1.6 meters or 5'3" wide, right? So the 2 posts of the entrance on the north and south sides had a width of 3 cubits, leaving a space of 14 cubits equals 7.42 meters, or 24 feet 6 inches. Had to be a mathematician to work these things out. Now, the third thing he deals with in the first part of verse 49 is the porch. And he says the length of the porch was 20 cubits from north to south. That means it was 10.6 meters or 35 feet. And the breadth was 11 cubits, which is 5.83 meters from east to west, 19'3". Here again, excuse me, here again, this would make it similar to the Solomonic temple, according to 1 Kings 6, verse 3, 1 Kings 6:3. And it says, even by the steps whereby they went up. So that tells us that the temple was set on a terrace at a higher level than that of the inner court. And just as, remember, the inner court was a higher level than the outer court. And so you had to go from ground level up into the outer court, then you got to go up more steps into the inner court, and now you're into the temple area. So, because of this, the temple area was reached by another set of steps situated in the space between the altar, which was in the inner court, and the temple porch itself. Now, the fourth thing in the second part of verse 49 is the pillars. Now, there were pillars by the posts, one on this side, one on that side. So on each side of the posts of the porch, these 2 pillars stood in the open space of 14 cubits, right? So they're in this open space. We have 2 pillars standing there. So that, again, this is very similar to the Solomonic temple, because in 1 Kings 7, verses 15 to 22, which is on the slide there, we read of 2 pillars that Solomon erected in front of the temple, which were named Yakin and Boaz. Yakin and Boaz, which you find it in 1 Kings 7, 15 to 22. Now, we don't know if the names of these 2 pillars will be the same. It doesn't tell us that, or whether they'll have new names. We do know the 2 pillars were freestanding in the Solomonic temple, and it might mean the same in this millennial temple as well. The text here doesn't tell us. Now we're getting into the holy place in chapter 41, verses 1 to 2. He brought me to the temple and measured the posts, 6 cubits broad on the one side, 6 cubits broad on the other side, which was the breadth of the tabernacle. And the breadth of the entrance was 10 cubits. And the sides of the entrance were 5 cubits on the one side, 5 cubits on the other side. And he measured the length thereof 40 cubits, and the breadth thereof 20 cubits. Now, Ezekiel now tells us about the first room of the temple, which is, of course, it's the holy place, okay? Remember, there's 2. There's a holy place, and there's the Holy of Holies. So we're looking at the holy place. In verse 1, he now deals, first of all, with the posts. So he brought me to the temple. Now remember, Ezekiel is a Levite and a priest. We saw that back in chapter 1. So Ezekiel would have been allowed to go into the first room, which is the holy place. And so he was allowed to enter in. And what happened was, he measured the post, 6 cubits broad on the one side, 6 cubits broad on the other side, and found them to be 6 by 6, 3.2 by 3.2 meters, or about 10'6" on both sides, which was the breadth of the tabernacle. What tabernacle is he speaking about? Well, he's speaking about the tabernacle he mentions here was the Mosaic tabernacle of the wilderness. So what Ezekiel is doing here, or what the angel is doing here, is that he's telling us that this was the same size as that of the tabernacle. Now, notice in this temple, there's no mention of silver or gold in this millennial temple, as there was in the tabernacle and the Solomonic temple. Remember that the walls were coated with gold. Now, this does not mean that there will not be any. It just doesn't say. Simply that none is mentioned at this point in time. And then in verse 2, he deals with the actual room of the holy place. The breadth of the entrance was 10 cubits. 10 cubits, 5.3 meters. That's the entrance, or 17 foot 6 if you're in England, 17 foot 6 or America. And that was the dimension of the entryway into the holy place. And the opening space of the entrance between the two side posts was 10 cubits or 5.3 meters. And the sides of the entrance were 5 cubits on one side, 5 cubits on the other side. And that is, they were, 2.65 meters, 5 cubits either side, or 8'9". So the width of each of the two side walls of the entrance into the holy place, including the width of the two posts, was 5 cubits, 2.65 meters. Then he measured the room itself. The length of it was 40 cubits, which was just a bit over 21 meters, or 70 feet. The breadth was 20 cubits, 10.6 meters, or 35 feet. And now the middle section of the temple between the porch, which is on the east side, the entrance side, and the Holy of Holies on the west side, is what is being measured here. And it was found to be 40 by 20 cubits, or 21.2 by 10.6 meters. So these dimensions here are the same as the Solomonic temple, but they're twice that of the holy place in the tabernacle. Remember the tabernacle, that was a tent of meeting. Now he turns to the inner room, which is now the Holy of Holies. Then went he inward and measured each post of the entrance, 2 cubits, the entrance, 6 cubits, and the breadth of the entrance, 7 cubits. And he measured the length thereof, 20 cubits, and the breadth, 20 cubits, before the temple. And he said unto me, this is the most holy place. So, notice in verse 3 here, now he deals with the entryway into the Holy of Holies. Then went he inward. Now, whereas the angel and Ezekiel went into the first room, the holy place, right? The angel goes into the Holy of Holies alone. Why? Because Ezekiel, even though he was a priest, he was allowed to go into the holy place, but he was not the high priest. Remember, only the high priest can go into the most holy, the Holy of Holies. So he was not allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. That privilege was reserved to the high priest exclusively. And this is a point which Hebrews 9 verse 8. Hebrews 9 verse 8 makes this point. So what we see here is that the angel alone enters the Holy of Holies. And first of all, he measured each post of the entrance, which he found to be 2 cubits. Little bit over 1 meter, or 3'6". And the entrance itself was 6 cubits, 3.2 meters, 10'6". The breadth, the width of the entryway to each of the two rooms narrowed. What we learn from this is that back in chapter 40, verse 48, the entryway started out at 14 cubits, started out wide. Then in chapter 41, verse 2, it narrowed from 14 down to 10 cubits. Then in 41:3, it narrows down again to 6 cubits. So it's getting this narrowing of the breadth of the entryway from the porch, from outside in the inner court, into the porch, which was 14 cubits to the holy place, which was now 10 cubits, down to the Holy of Holies, which was 6 cubits. What's it saying? It's narrowing the entrance to get into the Holy of Holies. What this is doing is it's emphasizing an increase in sanctity in this Holy of Holies. And he says here that the breadth of the entrance was 7 cubits, 3.7 meters, or 12'3". Now, in verse 4, he deals with the room itself. He measured the length thereof, 20 cubits, the breadth, 20 cubits. So it's a square. 10.6 meters square, or 35 feet square. And he says this was before the temple, meaning this was the whole dimension across the breadth of the temple. Down, up, down. Then the angel said to Ezekiel, this is the most holy place. So this most holy place was the Holy of Holies, and it formed a square of 20 cubits or 10.6 meters. So having measured this second inner room, he now deals with the wall around the temple and its side chambers. This we see in chapter 41, verses 5 to 11. Then he measured the wall of the house, that's the temple, 6 cubits, and the breadth of every side chamber 4 cubits, round about the house on every side. And the side chambers were in 3 stories, one over another, and 30 in order. And they entered into the wall which belonged to the house for the side chambers round about, that they might have hold therein, and not have hold in the wall of the house. And the side chambers were broader as they encompassed the house higher and higher. For the encompassing of the house went higher and higher round about the house. Therefore, the breadth of the house continued upward, and so one went up from the lowest chamber to the highest by the middle chamber. Verse 8, I saw also that the house had a raised basement round about. The foundations of the side chambers were a full reed of 6 great cubits. The thickness of the wall, which was for the side chambers on the outside, was 5 cubits. And that which was left was the place of the side chambers that belonged to the house. And between the chambers was a breadth of 20 cubits round about the house on every side. And the doors of the side chambers were toward the place that was left. One door toward the north, another door toward the south, and the breadth of the place that was left was 5 cubits round about. Okay. Now, in this passage, he deals with the temple wall and the side chambers. Now, remember, in the first part here of verses 5 to 11, he deals with the wall. He measured the wall of the house. It was 6 cubits or 3.2 meters or 10'6". So the wall of the temple around the north, west, and south sides was 6 cubits or 3.2 meters thick at the base, 10'6" thick at the base. This is the thickness of the actual wall of the temple building. It's a very thick wall. And then in second part of verse 5, he deals with the side chambers. Now, the breadth of every side chamber, 4 cubits, which is 2.1 meters, 7 foot. Round about the house, which is a temple, of every side. So, attached to the wall of the temple on the north, west, and south sides were side chambers in 3 stories. And those on the ground floor were all 4 cubits wide, right? And these ground floor chambers probably served as storerooms for temple equipment, as was true of the rooms in the Solomonic temple, mentioned in 1 Kings 6, 5 to 10, 1 Kings 6, 5 to 10. 1 Kings 6 and 7 have a lot of stuff about the temple. They could also be used for the storage of tithes and offerings, as was true of the second temple, according to Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, Malachi 3:10. In the first part of verse 6, he deals with the number of side chambers. The side chambers were in 3 stories, one on top of the other, one over another, 30 in order. So we're told here that these side chambers were arranged along the 3 sides of the temple. From the way the text reads, it can be interpreted in one of 2 ways. First option here is that there were 10 side chambers on each of the north, west, and south sides, consisting of 30 rooms in each of the 3 stories. That's the first way we can look at it. Second option is that there were a total of 33 rooms, 5 in the north, 5 in the south, and 1 along the whole length of the west wall, making 11 for each floor. Since there were 3 floors and 3 walls, that would make a total of 33 chambers. However, first option is probably the better of the 2, which is just 30 side chambers. Second part of verse 6 now, he deals with the construction of these side chambers. He says that they entered into the wall which belonged to the house for the side chambers round about, that they might have hold therein, and not have hold in the wall of the house. Okay. We know that the wall of the temple itself was 3.2 meters or 6 cubits wide at its base, very wide base. Now, as it ascended, it diminished in thickness. At 3 points, it served as support for the beams of the 2 upper stories of the side chambers. Remember, they had 3 stories, ground floor, second and third floor. The wall, the wall of the temple was now rebaited to avoid making holes in the wall of the temple structure so that they could provide bearing for the beams that hold the top 2 floors up. All right, now, verse 7, he deals with the comparative sizes of the side chambers. He says here the side chambers were broader as they compassed the house higher and higher. For the encompassing of the house went higher and higher round about the house. Okay. The Hebrew word here, kabab, not kebab, but kabab, C-A-B-A-B, for encompassing means winding. So it seems to imply here that there was a winding staircase that led upward to the top story. And so the chambers in the upper stories were larger due to the rebaiting of the temple wall as it ascended. So, as one went up a spiral staircase from the ground floor to the middle and upper stories, the chambers round about the temple, they widened at each level in proportion to the rebate that was in the wall lower down. So, the walls of the temple against which these chambers were built were now offset 1 cubit each story. If you're an architect, you can understand this, but I'm not an architect. Now, the first was 4 cubits, 2.1 meters or 7 foot. Second story was 5 cubits, 2.65, 8 foot 9. Third was 6 cubits, 3.2 meters, 10 foot 6. So therefore, the breadth of the house continued upwards, right? Now, because of the narrowing of the wall on which these chambers were built, the side chambers in the 2 upper stories, they became so much broader towards the house or on the temple wall side. But they were not widening towards the outside, which left the wall actually looking the same thickness all the way up. So one went up from the lowest chambers to the highest by the middle chamber. The topmost story, or the topmost level, the third story, was reached by a spiral staircase from the ground floor, which passed through the middle floor. And in verse 8, we have the platform of the temple. And I saw that the house, the temple, had a raised basement round about. So the temple building, therefore, stood upon a raised platform, and it was 6 cubits or 3.2 meters or 10 foot 6 above the level of the inner court. So we had to have steps to get up to it. So the temple was reached by those steps which we mentioned back in chapter 40, verse 49. And the foundations of the side chambers were a full reed of 6 great cubits. Now, that means 3.2 meters. This was measured using the, remember there earlier on we spoke, there's a cubit and then there's a temple cubit. The temple cubit is 21 inches. The regular cubit is 18 inches. So anything to do with the temple is 21 inches is a cubit. So here, the temple now stood on a raised, paved platform area, which was 6 cubits or 3.2 meters above the level of the inner court. And now in verse 9, he deals with the thickness of the walls of the side chambers. The thickness of the wall, which was for the side chambers on the outside, meaning this was the outer wall of the side chambers around the temple. This wall was 5 cubits, 2.65 meters, 8 foot 9. And it extended for 5 cubits, 2.65 meters, around the outskirts of the actual temple building. And that which was left was the place of the side chambers that belonged to the house. So outside the side chambers on the north and south sides, there was a free space, which is dealt with in verse 11. As the width of the house wall of the side chambers was 5 cubits, so was the width of the free space outside of them. So in verse 10, he deals with the space between the side chambers now. He says, and between the chambers was a breadth of 20 cubits round about the house on every side. So that's 10.6 meters or 35 feet. So between the wall of the side chambers and the wall of the cells in the inner court on the north and south sides, remember the east side is the entrance, west side we're going to see is a separate building altogether, was a space of 20 cubits. Actually, the west side is behind the temple. No one's behind the temple. Okay, now, verse 11 now deals with the doors of the side chambers. And the doors of the side chambers were toward the place that was left. One door toward the north and another door toward the south. So the approach to the chambers was by an entrance in the north and south walls. And the breadth of the place that was left was 5 cubits round about. So again, 5 cubits equals 2.65 meters or 8 feet 9 inches. The only entrance to the side chambers was from either the free space measuring 5 cubits, 2.65 meters, outside the chambers, with one door on the north and one on the south. So this means then that all these separate chambers were made accessible by means of communicating doors, right, leading from one chamber to another. There's only one entry from the outside on the north and south sides. You couldn't get to any other way. Now we see the building of the separate place. Separate place. Now, this is chapter 41, verses 12 to 14. And the building that was before the separate place, the side toward the west, was 70 cubits broad, and the wall of the building was 5 cubits thick round about, and the length thereof 90 cubits. So he measured the house 100 cubits long, and the separate place and the building with the walls thereof 100 cubits long. Also the breadth of the face of the house and of the separate place toward the east 100 cubits. This passage now deals with the special building of the separate place behind the temple. All right, so it's on the western side behind the temple, and in verse 12 he deals with the dimensions of this hinder building or the building in the rear of the temple. And the building that was before the separate place at the side toward the west was 70 cubits broad, making it 37 meters roughly, or 122 feet. This is the inner width of the building toward the west. Okay. All right. The furthest western part of the temple was the most holy place. That's in the western side. And then outside the most holy place, now outside the walls, there is this other hinder place, this other separate place. Okay. Now this building was between, and the wall of the building was 5 cubits thick, 2.65 meters, 8'9". The length 90 cubits. We had 48 meters, 158 feet roughly. So this building now was between the raised platform. Remember the temple was in a raised platform, and the side chambers situated to the north and south, where there was this space of 20 cubits. In Hebrew, this separate place is called Gizra, G-I-Z-R-A, Gizra. Again, it's on the west side of the temple. Remember that the entrance is on the east side, coming through the east side. It's on this Gizra, this separate place, is on the west side of the temple, with a large building measuring 70 by 90 cubits, 37 by 47 meters. So along with the temple itself now was a specific building situated behind and separated from the sanctuary proper. Okay, You couldn't get into the most holy place through the separate building. It's a separate building. Now, what was the purpose of this separate building? It was separated from it and sitting right behind the most holy place. Its actual purpose is, there we stated. We don't know what it is. Don't know what it's for. But perhaps it could be a special building to be used as a storage area, similar to the building mentioned in 2 Kings 23, verse 11. We don't know what it's for. In verses 13 to 14, Ezekiel now deals with the total dimensions of the temple, including the separate place. In verse 13, he deals with the length. So he measured the house, the temple, 100 cubits long, 53.2 meters, 175 feet. Now, this 53 meters, 100 cubits, this included three things. First of all, we had the separate place, which was 20 cubits. All right, so that's the first 20 cubits gone, 100 cubits all up. Second, we had the building of the separate place, which was 100 cubits. It also included the walls on each side at 5 cubits each, which makes it a total of 10 cubits, right? Walls were 5 cubits, walls on the side, 10 cubits. And that's how we measure the 100 cubits. Break it down even further. These 100 cubits would in detail include the following. First, we had the posts or the jambs, which measured 5 cubits, chapter 40, verse 48. Then we had it included the porch or the vestibule, which was 12 cubits, mentioned in chapter 40, verse 49. It would also include the other posts or jambs of 6 cubits, mentioned in 41:1. It would include the holy place, which we said was 40 cubits, mentioned in chapter 41:2. Fifth, it would include the other posts or jambs, which are 2 cubits in 41:3. It would also include the Holy of Holies at 20 cubits in chapter 41, verse 4. Then the wall, which is 6 cubits. Getting tired adding up here. According to chapter 41, verse 5. Eighth, it would include the side chambers at 4 cubits in 41:5. And last, it would include the outer wall at 5 cubits in 41:9. Add it all up, we got 100 cubits. It's 100 cubits. Okay. The building of the separate place. Okay, yeah. Look, continue on here. Continue on with this building. Yeah, verses 13 to 14. Ezekiel now deals with the total dimensions of the temple, including the separate place. In verse 13, he deals with the length. So he measured the house 100 cubits long. Didn't I just do this? Have I doubled up? Or have I? No, I haven't. Looks familiar. Okay. So again, he measured the house 100 cubits long, 53 meters. It included three things: a separate place, which is 20, building of the separate place 100. Have I doubled up here? Okay. Now let's so after dealing with the length of the temple, he deals with the breadth of it in verse 14. Also, the breadth of the face of the house and of the separate place toward the east was 100 cubits, 53 meters. So this dimension included two things. First up, the face of the house. Remember, the house is the temple. And second, the separate place towards the west side of the building. So it was the east front of the temple and its yard area, which also measured 100 cubits, matching the breadth of the building to the west. So the details here would make the total 90 cubits. Then by adding the 5 cubits each of the two walls, or 10 cubits, again, we arrive at 100 cubits on that side as well. All right, glad we're off of those walls. Now we're going to look at the interior of the temple. This is in verses 15 to 26. And he measured the length of the building before the separate place, which was at the back thereof, and the galleries thereof on the one side, and on the other side 100 cubits, and the inner temple and the porches of the court, the thresholds and the closed windows and the galleries round about on their 3 stories over against the threshold, sealed with wood round about, and from the ground up to the windows. Now the windows were covered. To the space above the door, even unto the inner house and without, and by all the wall round about, within and without by measure. Verse 18, and it was made with cherubim and palm trees, and a palm tree was between cherub and cherub, and every cherub had two faces, so that there was the face of a man toward the palm tree on the one side, and the face of a young lion toward the palm tree on the other side. Thus was it made through all the house round about. From the ground unto above the door were cherubim and palm trees made. Thus was the wall of the temple. Okay. So here, this is now dealing with the interior of the temple. First part of verse 15, he deals with the building of the separate place. And he measured the length of the building before the separate place. Remember, the separate place is on the western side, which was at the back thereof, and the galleries thereof. So these galleries were like balconies, all right? They're off on the one side, and on the other side, 100 cubits. So what he has dealt with in first part of verse 15 is the summary of the materials he's talked about previously. Now, he's already dealt with the separate place earlier in the verses preceding here. So in the first part of verse 15, he's simply summarizing what he's already said in verses 12 to 14. Only in the second part of verse 15 does he move into some more new information. So 15b to verse 17, he now gives us some more info. He talks about the inner temple, the porches of the court and the threshold, the closed windows, which he talked about back in chapter 40, verse 16, and the galleries, which he also dealt with in verse 15. But here we're told that these galleries are on their 3 stories over against the threshold, or the jambs. And he says that they're sealed with wood round about. So what that means is that the ornamentation of the walls and the walls on both sides of the doorposts were covered with panels. So the walls from the ground up to the windows were covered, and those above them were also paneled. So the whole area was paneled. Verse 17, it says, to the space above the door, even onto the inner house and without, and by all the wall round about, within and without. So what these verses are saying is that the entire interior of the temple was intricately paneled all around. It had a veneer of wood covered the walls from the ground above the door and all of the walls of the Holy of Holies of the temple. The inner house, which you see here, simply means it's the Holy of Holies, of course, and it was covered by wood paneling. So rather than as in the previous temples where the walls were covered with gold, then he says by measure. What that means is meaning that all the different parts of the building had their own specific dimensions. Then in verses 18 to 20, Ezekiel deals with the ornamentation of the inner walls. Verses 18 to 19 describe the cherub and the palm tree designs. And it was made with cherubim and palm trees and the palm tree. So in this design was between cherub and cherub, and every cherub had 2 faces. So that there was the face of a man toward the palm tree on one side, and the face of a young lion toward the palm tree on the other side. So thus was it made through all the house round about. So this was also similar to the Solomonic temple, as you can see from 1 Kings 6, 29 to 36. So the interior of the temple was intricately paneled and surrounded with a design of alternating palm trees and dual-faced cherubs. The 2 different faces of the cherub were each turned in opposite directions, so that each palm tree was between the human face of one cherub and the lion's face of the next cherub. So never 2 men's faces looking at each other, or 2 lions' faces looking at each other. Now, verse 20 now deals with the extent of the ornamentation. From the ground onto above the door were cherubim and palm trees made. Again, we have panels of wood covered the walls. Remember, from the floor to the level of the door lintels, and then the figures of cherubs and palm trees then covered the walls from the floor to the ceiling. So this was the wall. Thus was the wall of the temple, and that's what Ezekiel concludes with here. Now we're going to look at verses 21 to 26, chapter 41. As for the temple, the doorposts were squared. And as for the face of the sanctuary, the appearance thereof was as the appearance of the temple. The altar was of wood, 3 cubits high, the length thereof 2 cubits, the corners thereof, the length thereof, and the walls thereof were of wood. And he said unto me, This is the table that is before Jehovah. And the temple and the sanctuary had 2 doors. And the doors had 2 leaves apiece, 2 turning leaves, 2 leaves for the one door, 2 leaves for the other. And they were made on them, on the doors of the temple, cherubim and palm trees, like as were made upon the walls. And there was a threshold of wood upon the face of the porch without. And there were closed windows and palm trees on the one side and on the other side. On the sides of the porch, thus were the side chambers of the house and the thresholds. Okay, verse 21. He deals with the division of the 2 rooms in the temple. As for the temple, the doorposts were squared. And as for the face of the sanctuary, the appearance thereof was as the appearance of the temple. And then we had the altar of incense, which stood in front of these doors. So what we have here is that there was a door separating the Holy of Holies from the holy place. And in front of the door, inside the holy place, and facing the Holy of Holies, was the altar of incense. Remember, altar of incense, and you go to the holy place, and you go to the Holy of Holies. Now, in verse 22, he deals with the altar of incense, and he tells us that it was made of wood, 3 cubits high, 1.6 meters high, roughly, 5'3", 2 cubits long, 1.07 meters, 3'6". Now, it was made entirely of wood, and that included the corners, the length, and the walls. And he said unto me, This is the table that is before Jehovah. Now, in other words, what he's saying is, it was situated in front of the double doors which led into the Holy of Holies. Altar of incense was in front of the double doors which led into the Holy of Holies. This was also true with the tabernacle in Exodus chapter 30, verses 1 to 7. Exodus 31 to 7. And the Solomonic temple in 1 Kings 7:48. 1 Kings 7:48. Now we have 4 projecting corners on each of the 4 sides of the altar, which are also made of wood. Now, because at this point, instead of saying altar, what did the angel say? He says, This is the table that is before Jehovah. Now, some expositors take this second statement here to be a reference to the table of showbread rather than to the altar of incense. But it is much more in keeping in the verse that we're looking at here to make this the altar of incense. It's called the table because in some measure it actually functions as a table. Why? Because it held the coals upon which the incense was dropped and therefore burned. Yeah, it had to rest on something. It was a table. So in verses 23 to 20, first part of 25, he now deals with the doors of the temple. Verse 23, we're told about the doors themselves, and the temple and the sanctuary had 2 doors. The word temple here refers to the holy place, the word sanctuary to the Holy of Holies. And the doors which separated the porch, right? The porch is outside from the holy place, and those that separate the holy place from the Holy of Holies were both double doors. So there's a double door separating the porch from the holy place, and another double door between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. What do you notice here? Another major difference between the millennial temple and the tabernacle and the Solomonic temple is that there's no thick curtain or veil anymore, but simply a pair of double doors separating the 2 rooms. That's new. In verse 24, he deals with the construction of these doors. And the doors had 2 leaves apiece, 2 turning leaves. So each double door consisted of 2 leaves, and each had double doors. One towards the outside of the doorpost, one towards the inside of the doorpost. And the space between the 2 doors being the width of the door would make it 6 cubits or 3.2 meters. Because that was the dimension of the post. Remember, the post was 3.2 meters. So each of the turning leaves was constructed in two parts. There are two smaller leaves for each half of the door. So each leaf had two folding leaves of its own, making a total of 4 leaves for each of the double doors. So each had 2 main leaves, one for the north, one for the south side, and at the same time, each leaf had 2 leaves of its own. So each door had 4 leaves. Wow, getting there. So the first part of verse 25 now, he deals with their decoration. There were made on them, on the doors of the temple, cherubim and palm trees. So the doors themselves are also decorated with the same design as what we saw with the panels inside. And this is also similar to the Solomonic temple, which we learned from 1 Kings 6, 31 to 35. At the end of verses 25 and 26, he talks about the threshold, the porch and the side chambers. What he says here was that there was a threshold of wood upon the face of the porch without. This means there was a canopy, okay? That's what the Hebrew word implies here. There's a canopy over the porch in front of the vestibule. Word threshold here refers to a beam, and these beams served to hold together the walls of the temple and the porch. So this was also the case in the Solomonic temple in 1 Kings 7:6. First part of verse 26, he again talks about the decorations. And there were closed windows and palm trees on the sides of the porch, on the one side and the other side. So on both sides of the walls of the porch entrance, there were windows and palm trees. Now comes the conclusion of verse 26. He says, thus were the side chambers of the house and the thresholds. So he's now finished with the issue of the thresholds at this point. Okay, another picture of the temple again for you. All right, we're going to look at the chambers of the outer court, which is number 19 on that chart there. Oh, I'm going to say I can show you with the mouse, but you can't see the mouse. It's next to number 20. Okay, here we go. Will we get it done? Should do. Okay, the northern chambers. Chapter 42, verse 1 to 9. Then he brought me forth into the outer court, the way toward the north, and he brought me into the chamber that was over against a separate place, and which was over against a building towards the north. For the length of 100 cubits was the north door, the breadth was 50 cubits. Over against the 20 cubits which belonged to the inner court, and over against the pavement which belonged to the outer court, was gallery against gallery in the 3rd story. And before the chambers was a walk of 10 cubits breadth inward, a way of 1 cubit, and their doors were toward the north. Now the upper chambers were shorter, for the galleries took away from these more than from the lower and the middlemost in the building. Verse 6. For they were in 3 stories, and they had not pillars as the pillars of the courts. Therefore the uppermost was straightened more than the lowest, and the middlemost from the ground. And the wall that was without by the side of the chambers toward the outer court before the chambers, the length thereof was 50 cubits. The length of the chambers that were in the outer court was 50 cubits. And lo, for the temple were 100 cubits. And from under these chambers was the entry on the east side, as one goeth into them from the outer court. Okay. So this now deals with the chambers of the outer court. In verses 1 to 9, he deals with the northern chambers first. In verse 1, we have a prophetic transport taking place again. It says, then he brought me forth into the outer court, the way toward the north. So Ezekiel is now taken from the inner space of the temple to the cell buildings in the outer court, which were for holy use. Now, he went from the inner space of the temple itself to look at these chambers in the outer court. So, from the porch where he is standing back in chapter 41, verse 25, he is brought into the outer court via the inner court through the north gate. He brought me into the chamber that was over against a separate place. Remember, this is a separate place of the Gizra mentioned back in chapter 41, verse 2, which is over against the building which was toward the north. That separate place we're talking about to the west across there. Now, he had been taken to the block of chambers, which we talked about back in 41:10. And these were the priest chambers in the temple yard. And these were the accommodations toward the north and south sides of the outer court opening into the temple yard. You can see them there on your diagram. And this is where the ministering priest would stay, similar to those mentioned back in chapter 41, verses 5 to 11. And remember, but the only entry to these chambers of the Gizra was from the outer court, according to this passage here. And in verse 2, he deals with the location of the door. He said it was before the length of 100 cubits was the north door. That means it was 53 meters, 175 feet. Breadth was half of that, 50 cubits, 26.6 meters, 87 feet. The first one faced into the temple yard and consisted of changing rooms for the priests, but also dining rooms for the eating of the offerings. And we're going to see that in verse 13 to 14. Now, the second complex was separated from the first, so that there was a passage of 10 cubits, 5.3 meters, between them. Now, the second block was 3 stories high, which we spoke about that before, and that was facing directly onto the outer court. Now, according to verse 8, this was 50 cubits, 26 meters in length, and it continued by a wall for a further 50 cubits to balance at the 100 cubits, 53.2 meters. This was of the first block of rooms which you read about back in which we read about, in verse 7. So we've got 2 blocks of 3-story chambers. One of these was 100 cubits, 53 meters. Second block, separated from the first by a gap of 5.3 meters, 10 cubits. It had a wide passageway, was itself 50 cubits, 26.6 meters. But to balance out the remaining 50 cubits, there was a wall which extended over that distance, made it look symmetrical. Now he deals with the galleries. First of all, as to their position, it says over against the 20 cubits which belong to the inner court. So it was over against the pavement which belonged to the outer court, was gallery against gallery in the 3rd story. This was talked about back in 41:15. So the block of chambers of verse 1, which we saw between the 20 cubit wide Gizra, the separate place, on the south side, and the pavement running along the wall of the outer court on the north side, right? There's a 20 cubit wide gap there. Verse 4 describes the walk. Before the chambers was a walk of 10 cubits breadth inward, which equals 17 foot, something like that. This was a passage between 2 blocks of chambers. It was a way of 1 cubit, which equals about 21 inches or 0.5 of a meter, 1'9". It was a very narrow entry into these chambers, and their doors were toward the north. These doors opened out onto the passageway, which we just spoke about. If you look at the temple compound, it might make a little bit more sense. But again, we shouldn't be overly concerned. Why? Because none of us are architects. Verses 5 to 6, he deals with the comparative sizes of the chambers. Verse 5 deals with the facts. Now, the upper chambers were shorter, that is the fact. Well, why were they shorter? Well, because the galleries took away from these more than from the lower and the middlemost in the building. So that's why the upper chambers were the shorter. The chambers in the top story were smaller than those of the lower stories because the outer wall of the upper story was kind of slanted inward when compared with the lower parts of the wall, in order to leave room for the galleries which did not protrude beyond the leading edge of the lower wall. I know it's all confusing, isn't it? So the building became narrower as it rose upward. This is for the gallery, the chambers. Now, verse 6 gives us the reason for this. For they were in 3 stories, and they had not pillars as the pillars of the court. So this refers to cloisters inside the wall of the court. Therefore, for this reason, the uppermost was straightened more than the lowest, and middlemost from the ground. So because the galleries from the upper story did not project as they did from the front wall with the supporting pillars, right? They were built within the chambers, and they rested on the wall of the story below, because they didn't have pillars to support them. So this made the chambers of the upper story shortened to the extent of the space taken up by the galleries. And in verses 7 to 8, he deals with the wall. Verse 7 tells us that the length of the wall that was without by the side of the chambers toward the outer court before the chambers was 50 cubits, 26 meters, 87 feet. So that portion of the wall, which ran parallel to the longer block of chambers, was 50 cubits long. And from there it continued to the north gate of the inner court. And in verse 8, the length of the chambers that were in the outer court was 50 cubits, or again, 87 feet. This is the shorter block of chambers situated toward the outer court. Remember, we have an inner court and an outer court. You've got to come through the outer court first to get into the inner court. And lo, before the temple was 100 cubits, equals 175 feet, 52 meters, something like that, 52 meters. So the block of chambers alongside remember the separate place facing the temple was also 100 cubits. Now, according to verse 4, the chambers on the north and south sides of the inner court were in 2 blocks, divided by a passageway 10 cubits wide. And the situation of those 2 blocks is explained in verses 7 to 8. Now, the block of cells along the separate place, or the gizra, was 100 cubits, 53 meters long, same as the temple itself. And then the second wing of cells, which was opposite, facing the outer court, measured 50 cubits from west to east. And now, the outer wall of this block formed part of the boundary between the inner and outer courts. And the remaining length of 50 cubits then ran from the end of the shorter block to a point opposite the end of the temple proper. So this space of 50 cubits, 26 meters in length, was enclosed by a wall or a fence, and it was running in line with the outer walls of the block. And that is what all these words in translation are trying to show us here. Finally, verse 9, we have the entryway. And from under these chambers was the entry on the east side. The outer court was lower. Remember, it was lower down than the inner court. You had to get up steps to get to the inner court upon which the chambers stood. So the outer court was lower than the inner court upon which the chambers stood. So from these chambers was the entry to the inner court, which was on the east end of these buildings. It says, as one goes into them from the outer court. So from the outer court, there was an entrance to the chambers at the east end of the shorter block, with a flight of steps then facing east and running parallel to it. That is the end of the northern chambers, and that's the end of tonight. Oi, thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.